It was December 26, 1900, and the Hesperus moored off the coast of Flannan Isles, a small island belonging to Scotland. It was the relief vessel on its way to bring supplies and rotate the island's only residents, 3 lighthouse keepers. As the ship approached, the men on board peered anxiously towards the towering lighthouse. The lighthouse had no signal flag raised. Usually, upon the relief vessel's arrival, the crew aboard the island would signal the moored ship to let them know everything was okay. Somehow, the lighthouse loomed silent, and the island seemed as if it was abandoned. Something was amiss. This was completely out of the ordinary. The ship's captain ordered the crewmen ashore to investigate. Landing on the craggy rocks, the man climbed the steep path to the lighthouse, buffeted by howling winds and stinging sea spray. Reaching for the door, he found it ajar, creaking ominously on its hinges. Inside, the scene was both mundane and deeply unsettling. A half-eaten meal sat untouched on the table. There was a chair knocked over as if someone had risen abruptly. The beds were unmade and empty. A clock on the wall stopped as if it was frozen in time. Oilskins, essential for braving the brutal weather, were missing, all except one, and there was no sign of the men who would have worn them. The keeper's logbook was the last sign of anyone's presence, but its entries ended abruptly, giving no indication as to where the men were. It was as if the 3 lighthouse keepers, Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur, had simply vanished into the windswept void of Flannan Isles. Below, the crew of the Hesperus waited anxiously for news, the grim reality beginning to settle in. Where were the missing lighthouse keepers? All right, thanks again for joining in. This mystery is something else. It is going to give you a lot more questions than answers, and I promise you it's worth sticking around for. Now, the Flannan Isles is a rocky islet of the west coast of Scotland. It's long been known for its treacherous waters and its haunting beauty. Located in the Outer Hebrides, these desolate islands earned the nickname the Seven Hunters, from sailors who feared their jagged cliffs and unpredictable seas. For centuries, the Flannan Isles were little more than a remote outpost, visited occasionally by shepherds, lighthouse keepers, and the few who dared to venture out into no man's land. Often, it's said that the shepherds who visited the island would leave offerings at an ancient stone chapel, a quiet nod to the superstitions surrounding these isolated islands. By the late 19th century, however, these islands took on a new significance. With maritime trade flourishing and the waters around Flannan Isles proving particularly dangerous, the construction of a lighthouse became a necessity. Completed in 1899, the Flannan Isles Lighthouse was an engineering marvel for its time. It stood nearly 75 feet tall, and its light could be seen for miles. This was a crucial beacon for ships navigating the perilous North Atlantic, and manning the lighthouse came at a significant cost. The lighthouse required a crew of 3 keepers to operate it continuously, with a fourth man rotating in as relief during scheduled shifts. The work was grueling and isolating. Standard practice dictated that 2 men would always remain on duty, while the third rested, ensuring that the light never failed or faltered, and that all equipment on the island remained in working condition. In addition to managing the light, keepers recorded meticulous logs, documenting weather conditions, maintenance tasks, and any unusual events. Practice that would later prove pivotal in piecing together the mysterious disappearance of the 3 lightkeepers assigned to the Flannan Isles during December of 1900 were seasoned men, trusted for their reliability and experience. James Ducat, the principal keeper, was 43 years old at the time of his disappearance. He was a father of 4 from the Isle of Lewis. He had over 2 decades of service in the Northern Lighthouse Board, and he was known for his dedication and leadership. Thomas Marshall, the second assistant keeper, who was in his late 30s, hailed from Edinburgh. He had previously served at the lighthouse stations and was recognized for his meticulous nature and commitment to duty. He was married to a lady named Jane, and together they had 2 children. His family depended on his steady employment, making his disappearance a devastating blow not just to him, but to those around him. And Donald MacArthur, the occasional keeper, was filling in for the regular first assistant, William Ross, who was on sick leave at the time. Now, MacArthur, in his mid-40s, was a seasoned mariner with a reputation for a fiery temper, earning him the nickname the Roaring Boy. He was married to Isabella, and together they had several children. His temporary assignment to Flannan Isles was intended to be brief, but it became his final post. These men were not only colleagues, but also family men whose loved ones were left in anguish by their unexplained disappearance. Their personal lives and professional dedication added depth to the enduring mystery of the Flannan Isles Lighthouse mystery. Together, these men formed a team well equipped to handle the challenge and life aboard the island. Life as a lighthouse keeper at the Flannan Isles was far from ordinary. The work demanded constant vigilance, as the conditions were harsh and the supplies were rationed. You had to rely on resupply ships for food and water. Supplies were delivered by boat every 2 weeks, weather permitting, of course, and even then, the keepers had to hoist provisions ashore using ropes and pulleys to navigate the jagged cliffs. The keepers were expected to remain professional and diligent despite the isolation and the ever-present risk of storms that could batter the lighthouse and surrounding cliffs. Now, what made the Flannan Isles Lighthouse unique was its true remoteness. Unlike many mainland stations, keepers had no immediate recourse if something went wrong. Their logs often included notes about the weather and monotony of their task. The next closest lighthouse to Flannan Isles is about 20 miles away in a place called the Butt of Lewis. I know, that's funny. It's the smelliest island in the Outer Hebrides, if you ask me. But anyway, Lewis's Butt, as funny as that is 20 miles away and is definitely too far to swim for these guys. And then the next closest place you have is the Stornoway Port, which is about 60 miles away. So these guys are like literally completely out there on their own, completely reliant to supply ships and anyone that happens to stumble across the island. And an important note is that there was no vessel or any kind of lifeboats at the island for these guys to take. So when they were dropped off at the start of their shift, they were left completely on their own. When the lighthouse keepers would rotate through their shifts, these logbooks that they would keep served as the most important link to keep this thing up and running, because any problems, any issues with supplying, equipment, maintenance, and all that stuff, any happenings are in that logbook for the next crew who would take over. There's no telephones and there wasn't really any reliable radio communication for people on the island. The backdrop of this towering island in and amongst the foggy, stormy weather of the area is so ominous, and it really sets the scene as to why this disappearance is so eerie. The way that these guys disappeared, and when I say there's nothing there, there's absolutely nothing. It raises so many questions, which we'll get into. But in the days before the keeper's disappearance, they were following essentially a strict established routine. It was designed to ensure that the lighthouse operated smoothly despite all of the terribly harsh conditions there. Each man had specific responsibility, rotating between maintaining the light, conducting repairs, and handling domestic duties. The light itself required a lot of attention. It was fueled by oil and mounted to a system of mercury to allow the heavy lenses to rotate smoothly. This mercury, though efficient, was hazardous to handle, and the men unlikely knew of the dangers from the mercury handling. Every morning, the keepers would inspect the lighthouse for wear and tear, particularly focusing on the lantern room, where soot from the oil lamps would accumulate and obscure the light. Cleaning the lenses was a meticulous process, requiring care to avoid damaging the fragile glass. They would then check the surrounding equipment, including the foghorn and weather instruments, ensuring every single piece of equipment was in working order. Meals were simple, typically consisting of preserved meats, bread, and tea, prepared in rotation by whoever was off duty. During their brief moments of leisure, they would do things like write letters, read, or sit and play games, staring out at the waves, which were nothing but a reminder of their isolation from the mainland. Now, this regimented life left little room for surprises, making the events leading up to December 15, 1900 all the more puzzling. Twice a day, they would record the weather conditions in the logbook, noting the wind direction and the state of the sea. In this part, they would also record any unusual occurrences that happened. Now, we're going to come back to this in a minute, but upon the arrival of relief vessels, standard protocol required that the outgoing lighthouse keepers document all the significant maintenance changes and operational issues, but they would also oversee the transfer of supplies using the island's pulley system. And part of that was also bringing all their own supplies that needed to be returned to mainland back down to the dock. So for example, empty food tins, garbage, things like that. And on December 12th, James Ducat offered a detailed account of the men's observation and their duties. On December 12, 1900, the log notes severe weather conditions, with gale force winds battering the island. Marshall recorded that this storm was the worst he had ever seen, and Ducat mentions that all three men had been praying for the storm to abate. This entry is particularly striking as it suggests a level of fear and desperation that is not associated with well-seasoned lighthouse keepers. December 13, 1900. The storm continues to persist, and the log reflects a growing sense of unease among the men. Marshall wrote about hearing strange voices in the wind, a cryptic note that has fueled much speculation. Additionally, MacArthur, known for his strong demeanor, was noted to be crying, an unusual behavior that indicates the men were under extreme stress. And by December 14, 1900, the log entry for this day is brief, but it mentions that the storm continued. There's a note about damage to the west landing and that some equipment was missing or destroyed. And on December 15th, 1900, another entry is made thanking God that the storm has ended, that the sea is calm and it ends and it's cut off briefly. Now, one thing that's incredibly important to note that's still eerie with these notes is that only 20 miles away at the Lewis Butt Lighthouse, the log keepers there recorded no evidence of a storm, saying that weather was clear and things were normal. So how could it be that only 20 miles away that these men are experiencing a crazy storm? This discrepancy between the lighthouse at Lewis Island and the logbook from these men is incredibly perplexing. These details painted a haunting portrait of their last days. What could have been scaring them to the point where you have a seasoned lighthouse keeper spending his days crying? What could possibly cause these men to be observing this incredibly intense storm when only 20 miles away you have other lighthouses in the area saying that everything is clear and normal? But as much as these logbooks answer some questions, they also create as much of a mystery, and so does what was found at the scene. This confuses things even more, and let's get into why. So back to December 26, 1990, when the Hesperus arrived, so it's about 10 days after the last log entry, the crew of the Hesperus was accustomed to the routine lighthouse handovers. So immediately when they pulled the ground and they didn't see the signal flag and people scurrying around, they knew that something was amiss. Standard protocol dictated that lighthouse keepers raise a flag to signal their readiness for the incoming vessel. One of them would typically be waiting at the landing to help secure supplies and hand off their old stuff. But this time, there was no flag, there was no signal, there was no welcoming figures, just the relentless roar of the sea and the towering cliffs shrouded in an eerie stillness. Captain James Harvey dispatched Joseph Moore, the replacement keeper, to investigate the island. As he investigates the lighthouse itself, he starts to find oddities. The beds in the keeper's quarters were all unmade, as if the men had risen from them abruptly and never returned. Now, this is out of character for these lighthouse keepers because being cleanly and being tidy and keeping that place organized was a very rigid part of their duties. In addition, there laid on the table a half-eaten meal. The plates and cutlery had been untouched for days. The clock on the wall had stopped, while the logbooks sat in their usual place. There was no entries beyond December 15th. The clock in the lighthouse did require regular winding, so this was able to give the crew in the Hesperus some idea of the last time the crew might have been there besides the logbooks. As the relief keeper searches, he continues to find more and more clues. A deeper search reveals that the oilskins of two keepers are missing, suggesting that at least two of them ventured out into the storm, while yet a third set of them remains. Raising the question is either, why did one man stay behind, or why would one man go outside without his proper gear? Almost suggesting again as if these men left that lighthouse in some kind of hurry. The lighthouse itself showed almost no signs of struggle. The lantern room was clean and operational, indicating the men had fulfilled their duties before their disappearance, and almost no explanation as to where they could be. The isolation of the Flannan Isles also added to the growing tension. There was no villages, no passing ships, no place to hide, and nobody to provide help. There was no boat for the men to leave the island in, and if something sinister did happen to these crew, it's very possible that the very thing causing it is still located on this island. I'm sure this must have been super eerie for the crew of the Hesperus as they're investigating the island, knowing that whatever caused the disappearance of these men could be waiting for them. But left with no real tangible evidence as to where the men are, the Hesperus has no choice but to return to port and report their findings back to the officials. In the immediate aftermath of the grim discovery on December 26, 1900, efforts to locate the missing keepers began in earnest. The Northern Lighthouse Board launched an official investigation, dispatching Superintendent Robert Muirhead to the Flannan Isles. Familiar with the keepers and their routines, meticulously examined the lighthouse and its surroundings. He noted the damaged west landing and the scattered equipment, evidence of the violent storm. Outside, the west landing area was in disarray, with heavy equipment scattered and a railing twisted out of place, possibly a sign of a storm. Yet, there was no sign of the men, no sign of distress. Local police and maritime authorities were also notified, initiating a broader search and rescue operation. Boats scoured the surrounding waters and nearby islands. Everything was checked, but there was zero clues. There was no pieces of clothing washed up along the shore, no pieces of hair or blood scattered anywhere. There was literally no sign of these men. Without any bodies or definitive evidence, the investigators were left with only the haunting emptiness of the lighthouse and its very cryptic log entries, forcing them to try and rely on speculation as to what might have happened. A lot of different theories have come up. The most common theory is that somehow in a freak accident that the 3 lighthouse keepers fell victim to the harsh elements. The west landing was a critical point for receiving supplies, and it bore clear signs of violent weather. Twisted iron railings, scattered ropes, there was a broken box and overturned turf along the cliffs, and heavy equipment that seemed to be destroyed or missing. Superintendent Robert Muirhead proposed at this time that perhaps a rogue wave may have swept the men into the sea. Rogue waves are capable of suddenly rising to heights far beyond those in the surrounding swells. They're particularly dangerous in areas like the Flannan Isles, where sharp underwater topography amplifies their force. Such a wave could have easily overwhelmed the keepers, as they would have ventured out to secure equipment in the storm. The logbooks describe ferocious gales in the days leading up to December 15th, culminating in the very ominous final entry. Storm ended, sea calm, God is over all. This suggests maybe the men ventured outside, believing the worst was over, only to be caught off guard. Now, there's a lot of critics to this theory, and there's a few reasons why I don't think the rogue wave theory works, at least on its own as an explanation for sweeping all 3 men at once into the sea, though it very well might have played a part, which I'm going to get into them at the end of the episode because to talk about them now would give some spoilers away. But that being said, there's no shortage of speculation as to what might have happened. Now, another possibility that people bring up is that there was some kind of conflict between the men. Now, a lot of people speculate that human conflict might be to blame, that rogue elements and rogue weather have nothing to do with these men's disappearance. If you remember in the logbook, Thomas Marshall records how Donald MacArthur, the occasional keeper, who is also rumored to have a fiery temper, earning the nickname the Roaring Buoy, was feeling the effects of the isolation and stress. He was noted to be crying in what is interpreted as him having some kind of mental breakdown. Doesn't offer a lot more clues or insight into what kind of disturbance he was really going through, but what people think could have happened is that MacArthur, in this distressed state, leads to a physical altercation between the men, culminating in a few of them dying and perhaps the last one taking their life. Again, it would be pure speculation to put those things together and say that it actually happened. Actually, I'm going to be clear. All this stuff is probably speculation because, again, this is what makes it such a great mystery, right? What goes against this, though, is that there was really zero sign of a scuffle. There was still food on the table, and there was a chair that was laying on its side. The chair on its side is really the only thing that you could rely on to say, yeah, maybe there was a scuffle. But it just seems unlikely that a scuffle broke out involving 3 men and only a chair was on its side. When the scene was found, it was said to be in good shape overall, which again points to that something externally likely happened to these men that caused them to leave the lighthouse in a hurry. Some people think something supernatural could have been involved because the Flannan Isles themselves are steeped in local folklore. They've long been associated with supernatural creatures called fairies. Legends of sea spirits, selkies, and curses tied to the isles have fueled speculation that the keepers fell victim to some otherworldly. The log entry about strange voices in the wind has become a focal point for such theories, suggesting that the men may have been lured to their doom by forces beyond human comprehension. While captivating, they lack absolutely any concrete evidence, but they do seem to persist because I think of the eerie and isolating atmosphere on Flannan Isles. a place where I could see how myth and reality would blur. Another theory put forward, and actually I think there's a theory, it somewhat covers this in a movie, I think it's called The Lighthouse, but I could be wrong with the name. But in that movie, they cover a little bit of the story, and essentially this theory covers foul play. Somebody came to that island, another ship or a party of raiders, for any unknown reason. Maybe one of the men had a gambling debt. It's so hard to say. And then whoever landed at that island intended to do harm to those men and either took them and disposed of them at sea, or they were kidnapped. I don't know. Doesn't seem like the case to me, but of course it's possible. Another theory that's been put forward is that the three men, or at least one of them, was suffering from mercury poisoning, which can have a lot of neurological effects. The men would have been exposed to high levels of mercury as a result of maintaining the lenses, as during that time, lighthouse light bulb lenses were placed in a mercury bath, which had to be changed as part of regular maintenance. Mercury poisoning, however, is unlikely to explain the disappearance because the effects would be gradual and not acute. If the keepers had been exposed to mercury, we would expect chronic symptoms to appear over weeks and months. The sudden and mysterious nature of the event doesn't align with the physiological timeline of mercury poisoning. In the event of super high immediate exposures, you would expect things like respiratory failure and kidney damage, not mood shifts and psychological problems that are the result of brain damage over months and weeks of high levels of mercury exposure. I just wanted to throw it out there just because I've seen it kind of brought up time and time again that mercury could be to blame, but there's not a lot of fact or science to back that up. Interestingly, though, another theory that comes up has nothing to do with chemicals, and it has to do with maybe the fact that these guys were sick of their life. Somehow, the men hated this life of being lighthouse keepers and had arranged for someone to come and pick them up, and they would start a new life somewhere else. However, I feel like it's highly unlikely considering they all had families back home, they had wives, they had kids. Actually, maybe that's evidence for them wanting to leave. I don't know. Just kidding. But none of these things really seem to answer what happened to these men. And Superintendent Muirhead's investigation definitely leaned towards natural causes, specifically a rogue wave sweeping up the men who would have been down at the landing. Which again, I just want to point out earlier, another thing that doesn't work from that theory is that two of the men took their oil skins and one of the men didn't, right? One's left behind because in theory, one man was always supposed to remain back in the lighthouse. Like the third guy, normal procedure would never have been for him to join the other two down the landing unless he had some kind of emergency. And I haven't get into what could have happened, and this is speculation, but in these events, in areas where things are isolated, and I've brought this up time and time again in other episodes, the Shackleton expedition, where it takes one small, seemingly minor event to cascade into something much, much worse, like a hangnail turning into infection, turning into gangrene, and then people are trying to help you and they get hurt in the process, and it just starts snowballing from there. And it seems to me that with their sudden disappearance from this island, that something along those lines could have happened, where some seemingly innocuous events just transpired so quickly and got out of control so fast that we'll never be able to truly comprehend what happened. Now picture this. The storm had raged for days, battering the Flannan Isles with relentless wind and rain. Inside the lighthouse, the three keepers, James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, were worn down. The strain of the storm had left them exhausted, both physically and mentally. The pounding of the seawalls against the cliffs was a deafening reminder of their isolation. And though their professionalism had carried them through this storm and so many storms alike, this one felt unrelenting. By December 15th, the storm had finally subsided, leaving an uneasy calm over the island. By this point, the men are exhausted, recovering from the mental stress at everything that had happened. They were battered, but they were alive, the oilskins drying by the door, their beds unmade from the restless nights. Yet as the storm had left its mark on the lighthouse and the landing below, equipment would need securing. There would be a lot of maintenance and equipment to fix and bolster and tie down so it doesn't happen again. Being that December 15th is the last log entry, it's safe to assume that the men disappeared sometime around this window. The men, experienced and methodical, don their oilskin and grab their tools. MacArthur, the most senior of the group, filling in the role of the occasional lighthouse keeper, stays behind. Protocol dictated that at least one man remain in the lighthouse at all times to tend to the light and the logbook. As Marshall and Ducat descended the steep path to the landing, they're met with a scene of chaos. Heavy ropes lay tangled like seaweed across the jagged rocks, torn free from their moorings. A supply box, once securely fastened 20 feet above the water, was shattered, its contents completely washed away. The iron railings meant to guide them safely along the path were bent and twisted, a testament to the storm's power. The men, weakened from days of battling storm indoors, began their work cautiously. So, picture them at the West Landing, fixing up their gear, getting things prepared not only for the supply boat, but also tying things down and securing things so they don't get blown away again. Now, around mid-morning, while inspecting the damage at the West Landing, the sun begins to break through for the first time in days. The waters below, though still turbulent, seem calmer than they had before. Then it's here that something happens. Now, this is often explained by some rogue wave sweeping the men out to sea. I think a more common tragedy that we see happen time and time again is an accidental drowning, where one person falls in the water, and then in the commotion of people trying to help, others are dragged in with them, ultimately leading to more people drowning. So it's plausible to me that a rogue wave comes and sweeps somebody off the dock, but as I'll get into, it doesn't seem as likely that a rogue wave could have washed all three men away at once. Now, as the men worked, MacArthur stayed up in the lighthouse. Now, some kind of inciting incident had to happen, and Ducat and Marshall fall into the water. Now, inside the lighthouse, MacArthur hears the commotion. He rushes to the window, peering out towards the West Landing. Perhaps he caught a glimpse of the struggle he heard, or he heard the cries below for help. In a panic, driven by a sense of duty to his comrades, he did what he was never meant to do. He abandons his post. In the rush out the door, he fails to throw on his oilskin coat, and as he approaches the scene, he's struck with dread. Something is amiss. His colleagues have been swallowed by the sea. In a desperate attempt to help, MacArthur does everything he can, but unfortunately he ventures too close to the edge of the dock and the landing, and he's also pulled into the sea in the commotion. In particular, the currents around the Flannan Isles are extremely deceptive and strong. Even without a rogue wave, the interaction of tides and sharp underwater ridges creates absolute treacherous conditions. Once the men found themselves in the water, they would have had very little chance of survival, especially considering the water was freezing cold and they were wearing their gear. They were either wearing their oilskins or at least wool sweaters and clothes. The icy temperatures would have sapped any little strength that they did have immediately, and they likely were swept out by the currents and carried out to sea, and that sealed their fate, creating the enduring mystery of the Flannan Isles Lighthouse keepers. So in summary, some kind of inciting incident caused at least one man to go into the sea, acting as a catalyst for the second and then the third one to respond like an emergency to go down and help the other two, eventually one by one, all three of them falling into the sea. In terms of the theory that one rogue wave is responsible for sweeping all three men into the sea, remember that everything suggests at the scene when it was found that two of the men left the lighthouse probably as planned, wearing their gear, and a third one left in a hurry. Meaning that if the third person was responding to a rogue wave or some kind of emergency where the other two men were swept out to sea in the first place, you have to assume a second rogue wave would have had to sweep the third person out, because it doesn't seem like there's any indication that all three men ever left that lighthouse at the same time. Seems like two may have left in a hurry, and the third one shortly after, in an emergency, failing to put on his oilskin gear. I've seen some theories suggesting that maybe the lighthouse keeper in the lighthouse observed a rogue wave and ran down and tried to warn the other two, and they were all essentially swept up with one wave. And the reason that doesn't make sense to me is that rogue waves appear suddenly and very unpredictably. They often blend into the surrounding swells, especially in that rocky, turbulent area. There would be very little visual warning, even to experienced observers. And as the name states, rogue waves are just that. They're rogue waves. They're a singular event that's highly unpredictable. It arises from complex interactions with the wind and wave patterns. Unlike regular waves, they don't follow the predictable rhythm and they do often appear suddenly, towering 2 to 3 times higher than surrounding swells. Also, it's important to note that no other lighthouses in the area reported extreme weather during the same period. This casts a lot of doubt on whether the Flannan Isles actually experienced any violent surge in weather whatsoever. Moreover, seasoned keepers like Ducat and Marshall and MacArthur were well aware of the dangers posed by rogue waves. Why would all three men leave the safety of the lighthouse simultaneously violating protocol? And despite the thorough search of the surrounding water, no bodies were ever recovered, no pieces of equipment from the crew were ever recovered, so it just doesn't make a lot of sense. On top of that, you have the evidence inside the lighthouse suggesting that they left fairly quickly, which seems weird given that the last logbook entry clearly details clear weather. Now, one of the theories put forward by people is that maybe there was an issue with the dates, like they were recording with the wrong days, but again, it doesn't quite track. It's odd that you have a lighthouse 20 miles away with recording fairly calm weather during that time. These factors significantly challenge the plausibility of the rogue wave theory as a lone explanation for the disappearance of the Flannan Isles lighthouse keepers. At least it challenges the fact that a single rogue wave swept all three men out to sea. Just seems that the rogue wave theory, you have to stretch your brain a little bit more to make sense. And it seems more likely that just this confounding series of accidents led to the men being dunked in the sea, because this literally happens all the time. It was years ago, I think around 2006. I remember literally the same thing happening to my neighbor, where a young fellow went off the Lowhead Dam across the road from me. One person goes in to save him, and then another person, and it ended up with 3 people succumbing to drowning that day. And one of them was actually, believe it or not, a rescue swimmer in the Navy. So it just goes to show you, like, it happens quick and it's not unheard of. So regardless of what you want to take away from the story, the one thing that's clear is that something caused the disappearance of these 3 men, and we have no idea to this day what it was. It's definitely odd. You have mysterious logbook entries, you have supernatural lore surrounding the island, and you have super cryptic messages left about one of the people having a mental health breakdown. Of course, this is a mystery. Of course, this is mind-boggling. But over time, so many people have tried to solve this with no luck. The Flannan Isles mystery is now a story that's entrenched itself in maritime lore. The eerie note in the logbook about strange voices in the wind fueled imaginative retellings of the story with tales of malevolent spirits and curses. The story's enigmatic nature also draws endless speculation, each theory covering different types of natural disaster, rogue waves, interpersonal conflict, you name it. But again, whatever happened on that island, I think was truly a series of unfortunate ends that led to the circumstances where just all the evidence happened to be washed away. Definitely a puzzle I don't think we can solve, but I want to thank you guys for listening to this episode. I could really use your support by sharing this with someone if you could, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Thanks again, and we'll be back again next week.